The Last Laugh. The dinner invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock, embossed with gold lettering that seemed to mock me with its elegance. Christmas dinner at the Hartwell estate, it announced, as if I were merely another guest rather than the woman who had married into this family 23 years ago. I set the invitation on my kitchen counter and stared at it, feeling the familiar weight of their judgment settling over me like winter fog. My name is Sarah Hartwell, though I wonder sometimes if I'll keep that surname much longer. I'm 47 years old, a freelance writer living in a modest two-bedroom apartment in Portland, Oregon, a far cry from the sprawling Tudor where my ex-husband David still resides with his new wife, barely 6 months after our divorce was finalized. The invitation was their way of showing magnanimity, I supposed. Look how gracious we are, welcoming poor Sarah to Christmas dinner. I had been working on my novel for 3 years, stealing hours between freelance assignments that barely covered rent and groceries. It was a literary thriller about a woman who discovers her husband's secret life, and every page felt like bleeding onto paper. David used to find me hunched over my laptop at the kitchen table in our old house, pecking away at what he called my little project. His mother, Eleanor, was less diplomatic. "Really, Sarah," she had said during one of our last family gatherings, her voice carrying that particular blend of amusement and condescension she had perfected over 2 decades. "At your age, don't you think it's time to be more realistic about your capabilities?" The others had laughed, David's father Harold with his booming chuckle, his sister Margaret with her tinkling giggle that sounded like breaking glass. Even David had smiled, not quite meeting my eyes. That night, after everyone had gone home, I found David in his study with his laptop open to a dating site. The profile photo showed him 10 years younger, the bio describing him as recently separated, when we were still very much married, still sharing a bed where we lay like strangers on opposite shores of a king-sized mattress. The discovery didn't shock me as much as it should have. Perhaps I had known, somewhere deep in the quiet spaces of my heart, that our marriage had become a performance we were both too tired to sustain. The betrayal felt almost anticlimactic, like finding the source of a leak you've been hearing in the walls for months. "How long?" I asked him, standing in the doorway of his study. He didn't try to deny it. David had always prided himself on his honesty, though apparently that virtue had its limitations. "6 months," he said, closing the laptop. "Maybe longer." The real estate conference in Seattle. Yes. The marketing retreat in San Francisco. "Sarah, please. The weekend visits to your mother when she wasn't actually sick?" He looked up at me then, and I saw something like relief in his eyes. The relief of someone who no longer had to carry the weight of pretending. I never meant for it to happen this way. But of course he had. People don't accidentally create dating profiles. They don't accidentally book hotel rooms, or accidentally fall into bed with graduate students 20 years their junior. Rebecca, I learned later, was 26, and working on her MBA. She had admired David's presentation on sustainable business practices, and he had admired her admiration. The divorce proceedings were swift and surgical. David kept the house, most of our investments, and his family's approval. I kept my dignity, my manuscript, and a settlement that would cover basic living expenses for perhaps 2 years if I was careful. Eleanor made sure to mention, during one of our final encounters at the lawyer's office, that she hoped I would find my footing now that I was free to pursue my hobbies. My hobbies. As if 23 years of marriage had been an interruption to my real life, rather than the foundation I had built everything upon. I moved into my apartment on a gray November day, carrying boxes that contained the fragments of my former life. The place was small but had good light, and I set up my desk near the window where I could watch the seasons change in the maple tree outside. For the first time in decades, I had no one to cook for, no one to clean up after, no schedule to maintain except my own. The silence was overwhelming at first. I would wake in the morning and lie in bed, listening to the absence of David's breathing, the missing sounds of his morning routine. But gradually I began to hear other things. The rhythm of my own thoughts, the cadence of sentences forming in my mind, the whisper of possibility that had been drowned out by years of domestic orchestration. I threw myself into my novel with the desperation of someone learning to swim in deep water. Every morning I would sit at my desk with coffee that was still hot because no one had interrupted me to ask about dry cleaning or dinner plans. I wrote about betrayal and discovery, about the moment when you realized that the life you thought you were living was just an elaborate fiction.
I wrote about a woman who loses everything and finds herself in the rubble. The rejection letters arrived with predictable regularity. Not quite right for our list. The market for literary fiction is challenging right now. While your writing shows promise, we don't feel we can offer sufficient support for this project. I papered my bathroom wall with them, a gallery of polite dismissal that I looked at every morning while brushing my teeth. David, meanwhile, had married Rebecca in a ceremony at his parents' estate. I learned about it from Margaret's Facebook page, where the photos showed everyone looking appropriately festive and renewed. Eleanor wore the same silver dress she had worn to our wedding, as if she could retroactively bestow her approval on the more suitable match. I continued writing. I finished the novel and began querying agents crafting cover letters that tried to capture the essence of a story that felt too close to my own life to see clearly. More rejections arrived. I started a second novel, then a third. I took on more freelance work to pay the bills, writing marketing copy for startups and blog posts about productivity tips, all while my own productivity felt like treading water in an endless ocean. 2 years after the divorce, I received the cream colored invitation to Christmas dinner. David and Rebecca were hosting. Eleanor had written in her careful script, and they wanted to include me in the family celebration. The magnanimity was breathtaking in its condescension. I almost didn't go. I spent Christmas Eve staring at the dress I had planned to wear, a simple black sheath that wouldn't look like I was trying too hard or had given up entirely, and considered how much easier it would be to spend the evening reading by my fireplace with a glass of wine and Chinese takeout. But something in me rebelled against that choice. Not pride exactly, but a refusal to be erased so completely from a life I had helped build for over 2 decades. I had been Eleanor's daughter-in-law longer than Rebecca had been alive when she met David. I had organized Eleanor's birthday parties, sat through Harold's interminable golf stories, listened to Margaret's complaints about her own marriage with patience. I didn't feel. I had earned my place at that table even if they no longer wanted me to occupy it. The house looked exactly the same as I remembered, down to the wreaths on the double front doors and the precise arrangement of lights along the roofline. Harold answered my knock with the same booming greeting he had used for 23 years, as if I were a welcome guest rather than an awkward remainder of his son's previous life. Sarah, wonderful to see you. Come in, come in. Eleanor's in the kitchen, pretending she needs to oversee the caterers. The familiar choreography of family gathering unfolded around me. David embraced me with the careful politeness of someone greeting a colleague. Rebecca, lovely and young and obviously uncomfortable, offered me wine with nervous enthusiasm. Margaret asked about my little apartment with the bright interest people use when discussing other people's misfortunes. And Eleanor, magnificent in her role as family matriarch, swept into the living room with her arms outstretched, as if welcoming a prodigal daughter. Sarah, darling, you look wonderful. Doesn't she look wonderful, David? The divorce has been so good for you. You've lost weight, and your hair is different. Very bohemian. I accepted the compliment with the grace of someone who had learned to translate Eleanor's language over 2 decades. Bohemian meant I had stopped getting expensive highlights. The divorce being good for me meant I looked appropriately diminished. We gathered around the dining room table that had hosted countless family meals, birthday celebrations, and holiday traditions. I sat in what had once been my regular seat, though Rebecca now occupied the chair at David's right hand, where I had presided for so many years. The conversation flowed around familiar topics: Harold's golf game, Margaret's children's achievements, David's work expanding into sustainable energy consulting. And what about you, Sarah? Eleanor asked as the main course was served. How is your writing going? Still working on that book? The question hung in the air like incense, sweetly perfumed with false interest. Around the table, I could feel the collective attention focusing on me with the intensity of people preparing to witness something mildly entertaining. Actually, I said, cutting into my prime rib with careful precision, I have some news about that. I had received the call 3 days earlier, Jennifer Morrison from Morrison Literary Agency, calling to tell me that not only did she want to represent my novel, but she had already spoken to several editors who were interested. The book that Eleanor called my little project had found its way to someone who understood what I was trying to say. My novel will be published next fall, I continued, watching Eleanor's smile become slightly fixed. By Harper and Row. It's called The Architecture of Betrayal. The silence around the table was exquisite. David set down his fork with careful precision. Rebecca looked confused, as if someone had changed the rules of a game she was just learning to play. Margaret's mouth formed a smile of surprise. Harold recovered first, his booming voice filling the silence. Well, that's wonderful, Sarah. Congratulations. We'll have to throw you a book party. Oh, you don't need to do that, I said, though something warm and vindictive in my chest purred at the suggestion. Though I should mention, the publisher is quite optimistic about sales. They're planning a significant marketing campaign. This was true, though I had learned about it only that morning in an email from Jennifer. The early reader reports had been enthusiastic enough that Harper and Row was considering the book for their lead fiction slot. Eleanor rallied with the social grace that had served her threads of charity luncheons and country club politics. How exciting for you, dear. I'm sure it will find its audience. The way she said audience suggested a small group of people with questionable taste, but I let it pass. I was discovering that victory, even quiet victory, required a certain generosity of spirit. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I could feel the shift in the room's energy. I was no longer the object of pity, the cautionary tale of what happened when women got ideas above their station. I had become something else, not quite formidable, but no longer dismissible. After dinner, David walked me to my car. The December air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and winter rain.
Congratulations, he said, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. I always knew you were talented. I just, I never thought, you never thought I would actually do anything with it. I finished for him. He nodded, looking suddenly older than his 51 years. I'm sorry, Sarah, for a lot of things, but especially for not believing in you. I looked at him in the porch light. This man I had loved and lived with, and ultimately lost to his own version of middle-aged restlessness. I felt something shift inside me, not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of release. Thank you, I said. That means more than you know. I drove home through the quiet streets of Portland, past houses glowing with Christmas lights and families gathered around dinner tables. My apartment was dark and still when I arrived, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like potential, like a space where anything might happen. The book launched on a Tuesday in September. Jennifer had arranged for a reading at Powell's Books, Portland's iconic independent bookstore, and I stood behind the podium looking out at an audience of perhaps 30 people. Some I recognized, friends from my freelance writing network, neighbors from my apartment building, even my divorce attorney, who had somehow heard about the event. I read the opening chapter, the one where the protagonist discovers her husband's dating profile, and listened to the quality of silence that good writing creates. When I finished, the applause was warm and genuine, and during the question and answer session, a woman in the back row asked if the story was autobiographical. All fiction is autobiographical, I said, and all autobiography is fiction. We tell ourselves stories to make sense of our lives, and sometimes those stories are more true than the facts. The book found its audience gradually, through word of mouth and online reviews that described it as a searing portrait of betrayal and renewal, and a masterclass in quiet resilience. Sales built slowly, then rapidly, as readers discovered a story that seemed to speak to something they recognized in their own lives. 3 months after publication, Jennifer called to tell me that The Architecture of Betrayal had hit the New York Times bestseller list at number 7. A week later, it climbed to number 4. The week after that to number 2. And then on a cold morning in January, exactly 1 year after my Christmas dinner with the Hartwells, it reached number 1. I was sitting at my desk when Jennifer called with the news, looking out at the maple tree that was bare now, but showing the first signs of spring in the subtle swelling of its buds. I listened to her excited voice telling me about the sales figures, the movie rights inquiries, the interview requests, and felt a profound sense of completion. That evening, I went to dinner alone at a small Italian restaurant near my apartment. I ordered a bottle of champagne and raised a toast to the empty chair across from me, to all the evenings I had learned to enjoy my own company, to all the words I had written in the quiet hours when no one was watching. My phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from friends and colleagues, and buried among them was a text from David. Saw the news. Congratulations. You deserve this. I typed back, thank you, and meant it. Eleanor called the next day, her voice bright with the particular enthusiasm she reserved for associating herself with success. Sarah, darling, I just heard the wonderful news. We're so proud of you. I was just telling the ladies at Bridge that I always knew you had it in you. You must come to dinner so we can celebrate properly. I accepted the invitation, curious to see how this final act would play out. The dinner was smaller this time, just the core family, without the extended cousins and holiday guests. I arrived with a bottle of good wine and the confidence that comes from having nothing left to prove. The conversation was different this time. Eleanor asked detailed questions about the publishing process, the marketing campaign, the foreign rights sales. Harold wanted to know about the financial aspects, approaching the topic with the same analytical interest he brought to his investment portfolio. Even Margaret seemed genuinely impressed, admitting that she had bought copies for her book club. David and Rebecca were polite, even warm, but I could see the careful distance they maintained. I was no longer part of their daily narrative, but I was also no longer a source of pity or embarrassment. I had become something more complicated, a reminder that stories don't always end the way we expect them to. Near the end of the evening, Eleanor walked me to the door, just as Harold had done at Christmas. You know, she said, adjusting one of the wreaths that still decorated the entrance. I may not have understood what you were doing at the time, but I can see now that it was important work. Necessary work. It was as close to an apology as Eleanor Hartwell was capable of offering, and I accepted it with the grace I had learned to cultivate. Thank you, I said. That means a great deal. 2 years later, I am sitting in my home office, no longer the corner of my apartment, but a proper room with built-in bookshelves and a view of the garden I have started cultivating. The success of my first novel led to a 2-book contract, then a 3-book deal with a different publisher. I have written about love and loss, about the stories we tell ourselves and the truths we discover when those stories fall apart. My second novel, about a woman who starts over at 50, spent 6 weeks on the bestseller list. My third, a meditation on friendship and forgiveness, comes out next month. I have learned to inhabit my success comfortably, neither apologizing for it nor wielding it as a weapon. I receive Christmas cards from the Hartwells now, the kind of polite acknowledgement extended to family, friends, and distant relatives. David and Rebecca had a daughter last year, and their holiday photos show them glowing with the particular happiness of people who have found their proper lives. I look at these pictures with something approaching tenderness, grateful that we all found our way to where we needed to be. Sometimes, when I am struggling with a difficult passage or questioning whether a story is worth telling, I think about that Christmas dinner when Eleanor asked about my little project with such amused condescension. I think about the laughter that followed, the casual dismissal of decades of dreaming and hoping and working towards something I couldn't yet articulate. The revenge, if you can call it that, was not in proving them wrong, though there was satisfaction in that. The real victory was in proving myself right, in trusting the voice that whispered in the quiet hours that I had something to say, that the words accumulating on my laptop screen mattered, that the story I was telling was worth the years it took to tell it properly. I write every morning now in the golden hour just after sunrise, when the world is still soft with possibility. I have learned to treasure these moments of solitude, to sink into the particular silence that surrounds the act of creation. The words come more easily now, flowing from some deep well of experience and observation that I spent decades unknowingly filling. My life is smaller in some ways than it was during my marriage, fewer dinner parties, less social obligation, no one to share the small domestic pleasures and irritations that make up the texture of daily life. But it is also larger, expanded by the recognition that I am capable of more than I knew, that the stories in my head are worth the effort it takes to wrestle them onto the page. I think often about the woman I was 3 years ago, sitting at her kitchen table in a house that no longer felt like home, typing away at what everyone called her hobby. I wish I could tell her that the words she was writing in those stolen hours would eventually find their way into the world, that her quiet persistence would be rewarded, that the laughter echoing from the dining room would eventually fade into irrelevance. But perhaps she wouldn't have believed me. Perhaps she needed to discover her own strength in her own time, needed to learn that the deepest satisfactions come not from external validation, but from the simple act of doing the work that calls to you, regardless of who is watching or what they think. The maple tree outside my window is in full leaf now, casting dappled shadows across my desk as I write. In a few hours, I will walk through the garden. I am still learning to tend, checking on the tomatoes and herbs I planted last spring. This evening, I will read in my favorite chair with a cup of tea, and the cat I adopted from the shelter, a gray tabby who purrs like a small engine and has no opinion about my writing schedule. It is a quiet life, but it is entirely my own. And in the end, I have learned that is the most profound victory of all, not the recognition or the sales figures or the satisfaction of watching former skeptics eat their words, but the simple knowledge that I trusted myself enough to keep going when everything seemed to be falling apart. The story I am working on now is about a woman who plants a garden after her divorce, who learns that some things that appear to be ending are actually beginning. It's a metaphor, of course, but metaphors are how we make sense of the incomprehensible business of living. We dig in the dirt, plant seeds in faith, and wait to see what grows. Sometimes, if we are very patient and very lucky, it is exactly what we were hoping for all along.